So we should start now. So our topic is finance, and the main part of that topic is the relation of finance to the real economy, and in particular to the production system. But today I want to begin our discussion with a preliminary to this main topic, which is the relation of the state to the capital markets, to the world capital markets, and also to the domestic capital markets. And this is a topic of very great practical importance, lying at the intersection of economics and statecraft. And one of my motives is that I'm especially interested in hearing what Danny has to say about this topic. So let's go back to the 19th century. And the late 19th century until the First World War, there was a so-called gold standard, with the money having a metallic base, gold, and gold would flow out, gold would flow in, and there would be a kind of automatic mechanism that kept the state in line. The economist Kalecki made the very acute observation that the function of the gold standard was to make the level of activity, of economic activity, depend on the level of confidence. So it wasn't necessary to articulate very vigorously a doctrine of financial and fiscal orthodoxy, because the gold standard did the work. Then the gold standard, in the second contemporary episode of globalization, was eventually cast aside, although the United States only definitively abandoned it in 1974. And states then throughout the world, in a world in which the dollar has remained the reserve currency of the world reserve currency in which most payments among nations are made, succeeded to gold to some extent in a much lesser way. And states found themselves required to build up reserves in hard currency, and especially in dollars, as a safeguard against a balance of payments crisis. Now, against this background, there is a widespread idea in the world that globalization, and in particular financial globalization, requires the obedience of the state to fiscal rectitude. Otherwise, there will be trouble. But if we look around the world, we see, in fact, that whether there is this trouble or not depends very much on the content of domestic policies. So, for example, China and the Northeast Asian economies based their early development on a series of policies that had the effect of diminishing the dependence of the state on the world capital markets. These were policies that sustained a high level of domestic saving rather than a reliance on foreign capital, and tightly controlled outflows of capital. Now, by contrast, for example, the Latin American countries adopted a series of policies that we could consider as a kind of functional equivalent to the 19th century gold standard. These were policies that acquiesced in a low level of domestic saving, a consequent reliance on foreign capital, and an opening of the capital account, an opening to capital flows in and out of the economy. So that the state became dependent on financial confidence, and especially on the confidence of world financial markets, just as the gold standard in the 19th century had done automatically. And that's the sense in which we could take this paradigm, this Latin American paradigm, as a functional equivalent to the gold standard. Now, I think this is a very important element in understanding the fragility of the Latin American economies. The state was placed on its knees before the world capital markets. But this subjection of the state, this dependence on the world capital markets and on financial confidence, rather than being identified as a problem, was seen as a solution. It was seen as a solution by the holders of capital and their representatives, because it tied the hands of the state and prevented it from embarking on what were regarded as nationalist or productivist adventures. Now, one of the practical implications, so it's important to remember then that it's not globalization as such that imposes this constraint, or even financial globalization. It's the interaction between the present system and different trajectories of domestic policy that can either increase or diminish the vulnerability of the state to these vetoes by capital. Now, a practical implication of this discussion then is that even for those states that have not adapted the Latin American submissiveness, it will be important to build up a war chest in hard currency of foreign reserves, and that has been characteristically in the dollar. And it's very expensive to maintain these reserves, but they could be taken as a condition of the independence of the state vis-a-vis the capital markets. National independence is expensive, and this is part of the price. So we could consider that, as it were, the first element in the fiscal shield of national rebellion, for a nation to be able to be daring, audacious in developing a strategy of economic growth. It needs to be able to protect itself. And the first and most tangible element of protection is this protection against the balance of payments crisis through the development of this war chest, as I described it. Now, of course, even this element is subject to some variation. So the dollar will not be the reserve currency of the world forever. And there is now increasing discussion of alternatives to the dollar among the major continental developing economies, for example, the BRICS. This is one subject that the BRICS have increasingly discussed among themselves, with the idea of using direct transition in a payment system, bypassing the dollar among themselves as a step toward the final dethronement of the dollar, much to the irritation of the American statesmen. And the recent sanctions against Russia, against the Russian central bank reserves, have demonstrated eloquently the dangers of this particular form of safeguard and susceptibility to subversion or containment. Now I come to the second element in the discussion. The second element in the discussion has to do with the maintenance of a high domestic saving rate as another way of counteracting the dependence on confidence by the international financial markets. So theoretically, it was established by Keynes, it's a proposition of Keynes's economics, that saving should be seen basically as a consequence and not as a cause of growth. If there's effective growth, it will take care of the savings problem. And the issue is, what are the strategic implications of this theoretical idea for the major economies in the world, especially the developing economies? There's a problem. The problem is that this theoretical idea seems to fail to recognize the importance of having a savings buffer in the initial steps, in the initial moves of a rebellious strategy of national development. Savings is the consequence of growth, but it is the consequence of growth over time. And when you're staging a national rebellion, you may not have the necessary time, and thus it may be crucial to develop or to enforce a high level of saving, both private and public, in the early stages of a rebellious strategy of national development. And it may even be the case that this imperative of sustaining a high level of domestic saving trumps the arguments in favor of counter-cyclical management of the economy, the Keynesian arguments. If there's a slump, you spend. But there may be a reason not to spend if there is a higher consideration, the higher consideration being to preserve the conditions of national rebellion. So let's say that this emphasis on raising the level of domestic saving is the second element in the fiscal shield of national rebellion. It's much more equivocal than the first element, the hard currencies, but it is nevertheless powerful. Now we come to the third problem. And the third problem has to do with the doctrine of sound finance, sound fiscal policy, meaning that the state should maintain, whenever possible, a so-called primary fiscal surplus, meaning the surplus once the interest on the public debt, on the sovereign debt, is disregarded. Now here there's a much more complicated question, because now we're talking about the role of fiat money, of paper money, in establishing credit within the economy. And once again, as a theoretical matter, it seems to be true that the state could, in principle, expand money and credit being more or less the same thing, so long as the money is used to invest in the expansion of output and the enhancement of productivity. This is what economics might say. And there's, no, there's nothing wrong with the manipulation of credit and the economy, so long as the money is used wisely. Now, what should we think of this as a practical matter? So we can distinguish two elements. So, or as it were, two dangers. So first, there's the question of, there's the danger that this operation of creating through fiat currency the monetary base for productive advance may go off the rails in some way. It may not work. It may take time to work. It may produce an inflationary episode before it manifests its productive result. So there are a series of economic doubts about trusting to this theoretical idea. But now we come to the second level of consideration, which is practical and political. In many of these economies, like the Latin American economies, the rentiers are armed and represented by the financiers and bankers. They exercise immense influence on orthodox opinion. They speak through the business press, through the major media. So if they knock on the door and you're a sensible, good-hearted, God-fearing person, your first inclination will be to send the rentiers to hell. But you should stop and think for a moment and look around, first of all, to assess the depth and strength of your political base and your popular support, and the force of the extortionists. They are extortionists. But the question is whether you should pay the extortion price by accepting this sovereignty of the doctrine of the primary fiscal surplus. You have to consider the matter dispassionately, taking to heart the maxim that Pitt the Younger took as his lodestar. Pitt the Younger, the longest serving prime minister in British history. No concessions except to threats. So,
so the questions are, how did we get here to make finance so important, and what's the appropriate role of finance in a modern economy? So credit is something that no economy can live without, but credit is also something that historically has always been subject to cycles of exuberance followed by sharp contraction and often crisis and crash. So there's nothing older than financial crises and financial crashes in history. So this seems to have been one key aspect of finance and credit is the cyclical nature of the financial system. So what has changed, I think, over time and during different periods of history is not the proclivity of financial systems to crises, whether it's the state that's on the other side or whether it is private borrowers or lenders on the other side. What's changed over time is not the proclivity of a financial system to periodic crises that might happen every 10, 15, 20 years. It's much more sort of the costs of these crises and the consequences. So when the financial system and the credit system is relatively small in relation to the economy as a whole, these crises, these credit cycles, the downturn may not be of significant consequence when the financial system has become hypertrophic, has grown. As after the 1990s, we have had extremely financialized systems domestically and globally. Then you get into this kind of a situation where finance both has the ability to hold this gun to your head, and in the case of a sudden stop of financing or sudden reversal in financial flows or credit reversals, you have very deep crises with very significant cost to economic activity, unemployment, economic collapse, and so forth. And what really stands out in the period after the 1980s is not, again, the regularity of these crises, sort of the 1992 debt crisis in Latin America, 97, 98 Asian crisis, the Russian crisis, then again a series of crises, the peso crisis again in the 2000s, and so forth. It's how costly these things have been because the financial sector has become so large. There has been so much financialization. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how we let this thing happen, because I think it ties with one of the key themes of this course about the important role of ideas, because I think the growth of the financial system, financialization after the 1990s, was intricately linked with a number of narratives, a number of stories, a number of ideas. Some of them came out of the economics discipline, but it was really more that the economics discipline was sort of a validator of these stories about the role of finance, rather than necessarily so much the origin. And there were a number of stories about the role of finance that went simply beyond that every modern economy requires finance. That's always been true, but of course under the period of the 1960s through the 1970s, the financial system had been relatively stable. The downturns had not caused significant crises, and what happens after the 1990s is this wave of deregulation, letting finance go free, both domestically and internationally. That makes all these financial magnitudes, financial aggregates, whereas the size of the stock market, whereas the size of leverage, whereas the size of the bond markets, whereas the size of cross-border flows, these magnitudes start increasing and become very large multiples of things like GDP or income or sort of real variables. And so therefore the reversals become that much more costly. Key in this, of course, argument was key in this narrative was this partly, of course, this belief that markets worked relatively well, so that financial markets version of the story would be that if we let financial markets work well, that they would allocate savings and finance to the right kinds of sources. So finance would go from households and countries that had high savings but didn't necessarily have a lot of investment possibilities or productive projects to firms or countries which had investment potential or which had high productivity potential. So that finance would be able to allocate savings and credit, and that by regulating finance too much, we were preventing this from happening. The stories on the domestic front and the international front paralleled each other, because just as you can believe that domestic financial deregulation, lifting the restraints on domestic finance would ensure more plentiful credit for home buyers, more plentiful credit for small business owners, more plentiful credit to parts of the country that had been starved of credit. You would also believe internationally in the global version of this that basically removing restrictions to cross-border flows of capital would allow rich countries with a lot of savings to transfer resources, to transfer credit, to lend to poor countries which needed money, which needed finance in order to invest in productive projects. That was one argument. A second argument was actually the one that Roberto mentioned with a very positive spin on this argument about the advantage of financial markets to exercise a discipline, not just on borrowers, but actually on sovereign states. So this was an active argument for financial liberalization and the global sphere. That is to say that having greater financial discipline, that if states, governments were at the mercy of financial markets, that they would be forced to actually engage in more responsible policies, whether it was more investor-friendly policies, whether it was policies that prevented them from inflating their economies, running too high inflation, whether it's policies to go on sort of spending binges and overextend the state by having too much fiscal expenditure. The argument was that financial discipline or financial markets, beyond simply allocating savings and credit to where they were most needed, would actually be an instrument for improved governance, would enhance the way that public institutions worked because of this mechanism of financial discipline. Now, sort of with hindsight, and perhaps also with a bit of, could have known part of this ex ante as well, with hindsight, we know that neither of these arguments really held out. One of the paradoxes of the period of financial globalization since the 1990s is that on the whole, finance has gone rather in the wrong direction, which is to say it has gone, instead of from the rich to the poor countries, on the whole has gone mostly from the poor to rich countries. That is, the net direction of finance has not been in the way that most people were expecting. And within countries, of course, we had the consequences of financial bubbles and the financial crisis that was linked to the mortgages of the late 2000s, which showed again sort of this, this periodic euphoria ending with the bursting of the bubbles and financial crashes, which was extremely costly in the case of this particular housing bubble within countries. And so this notion that finance was, that financial markets would do their job rather well did not work out. I think this has been a sort of has dented significantly the story that you could rely on financial markets, not just simply to provide sort of, to behave responsibly, that is to allocate risk and take risk appropriately, but also to serve the real economy by allocating credit and finance to where it was needed. So that story had to be qualified, and that was qualified in the economics narrative by sort of taking into account that in fact there are a wide range of market failures to which financial markets are susceptible, such as bank runs, such as asymmetric information, such as agency problems that drive a wedge between what individual heads of corporations or heads of firms versus the owners of capital want to do. The rather striking thing about this is that even though that the underlying narrative about the benign nature of finance and therefore the need for a kind of a light regulation did not result in a significant reversal in the nature of regulation of finance. We talk a lot about sort of reversals in globalization. We talk a lot about sort of, the excesses of finance, the problems with excessive financialization. But if you look at the actual nature of financial regulation today, there has not been significant changes that has restrained financialization to any significant extent. So that problem, to a very large extent, remains with us. With regard to the financial discipline argument, that also has shown to be rather empty, because it turned out that financial markets were actually not very good at discriminating between governments that were doing the right things for their economies versus governments that were not. So in fact, access to finance, access to foreign finance, in many cases enabled many profligate governments to keep doing what they were doing because now they had access to finance. All they had to do was offer interest rates that were a little bit higher than what the major financial centers did. So in the period in the years before the Euro crisis, for example, a lot of the governments in the southern in Southern Europe, whether it was Greece or Spain or Portugal, could go on these huge spending sprees, spending borrowed resources not on productive capacity, but largely on construction, on non-tradable activities, investments that would not generate the productive capacity to pay back the accumulated debts. But it wasn't until really the mortgage crisis struck in the United States that that process came to an end, and Greece and Spain and Portugal ran into this problem. Whereas if you look at the whole decade before that, it's very hard to argue that the large current account deficits of these countries that were being financed with a lot of bank credit, with lending from Germany and other surplus countries, was being put to a good play, was being put to a good use. The same can be said of my own country, Turkey, which until very recently, literally for 2 decades, has been running largely irresponsible macroeconomic policies off the back of being able to constantly borrow internationally, very large current account deficits. And it's very hard to say that financial discipline has actually enhanced the quality of government policy making. It's much easier to, in fact, make the opposite argument, which is that financial discipline, financial markets have actually enabled fiscal indiscipline and economic policy indiscipline, because it makes the source of fund so much more elastic when you can actually borrow. You're not limited to your domestic lenders, but you can borrow from global financial markets simply through the carry trade by offering interest rates that are a little bit higher than what's offered in the major financial centers. So in light of all of this, what does this imply for some of the questions that you have raised, Roberto? I would say that on I view financial markets less of a threat to what you call a kind of a rebellious economic policy, because financial markets are not very discriminate in terms of now, of course, if what that rebellion entails is active expropriation, a determination to interfere in debt service, then of course you can have a very sudden capital outflow or sudden cutoff in finance. But I think that financial markets are rather permissive, that they don't particularly care about the type of policies that you engage in, even if you call it rebellious, as long as they can see that there's a potential to make money. And since a lot of the policies that we're talking about in the context of these growth strategies, or rebellious strategies, if you will, are strategies that are meant to enhance the productivity of the economy, they're not fundamentally inimical to finance and to relatively free finance, because these are essentially ways in which that greater surplus and greater productivity enables finance also to earn its share. So I think this I don't think one needs a kind of an insulation from financial markets or from financial discipline in quotation markets to engage in policies that might be a radical departure. I also see that there is a big risk in the fiscal dimension of this, the fiscal component, which is to raise the fiscal shield by trying to raise domestic savings, in particular domestic fiscal savings, too much, because let's put a name to what that policy would be. That would be a policy of austerity, because the only way you can actually raise a fiscal shield would be to significantly reduce public expenditures or significantly increase the taxation of the private sector. And I think if you want to get sort of political support and political buy-in during a transition to this new kind of economic policies, I think doing this at a time of fiscal, at a time where you're actively also pursuing policies of fiscal austerity with their adverse effects on economic activity through the standard Keynesian channels, I think that's going to make it very, very difficult for you to maintain political support for what you need to do. So I see that as a kind of something that is not particularly needed or not particularly helpful. I think what's very useful, what's very important in this transition, particularly in the early stages, is I think communication and political buy-in. So I think if you have a good story about what your development strategy, what your growth strategy is, I think being upfront about what that story is, ensuring that makes sense. This is how I'm going to generate inclusive growth. This is my strategy. And this is the political basis. I'm just not doing this on my own. This is the stakeholders that have bought into this strategy. I think that's going to be much more effective in terms of bringing finance and private financial markets along than I think trying to raise that fiscal shield. But I'll end by going back to the initial point that I want to, I think it's common in there, that financial markets and the government or the state have always been sort of very tightly, have been always very tightly encumbered with each other. That there's never been really a kind of a financial system that's operates on its own on private financial markets that sort of separate from the state. Financial markets owe their existence to the state because financial markets developed in any real sense because of the need of the state to borrow. So it was the state that actually allowed financial markets to borrow. You cannot have a banking system without state regulation because banks are subject to bank runs, and therefore you need the sort of a lender of last resort from the state, in return for which the state must regulate the banks, because simply providing the floor in terms of the lender of last resort without corresponding regulation to prevent excessive risk taking would then push the system all the way to the other side. Now, so that's so the tough question before us is can we go from the limited goal of making finance safe for the real economy through regulation, through oversight, through the kinds of things that, for example, are discussed in the readings for this week. Can we move beyond making finance safe for the real economy to making finance actually a real contributor to the real economy?
Yes.
So that's a different question. And it's a much more demanding question.
Yes.
And too much of our current policy discussion has just the limited goal. Well, it's not really limited because financial systems go crazy. Their costs are extremely large, as we have seen time and again. So financial stability is a key objective. But it's crazy that our goals from the financial system is simply that they do no harm, right? We want them to do also a lot of good things. And it's not entirely clear how we actually achieve those broader objectives.
Yeah. So I just want to make a few very quick observations before I go on to our main topic, which is the relation of finance to the real economy and to production. First, I did want to emphasize the point that I made at the outset, that globalization and financial globalization do not impose on the world a uniform straitjacket. The force of the straitjacket depends on the domestic policies. And that's shown very clearly by the contrast between the Latin American economies on one side, which adopted the functional alternative to the gold standard, and China and the Northeast Asian economies on the other side. Now, second, if we're talking about international finance, the world capital markets, it's very clear that we have to distinguish between the religion of finance, the preconceptions of the financiers, and the economic realities which create opportunities for gain. International finance in the medium to long term only cares about the opportunities for gain. And the religion of finance only matters in the short run. And so that illustrates then the tragic mistake of the Latin American economies in having signed on the bottom line, illustrating the general principle that rebellion is not always rewarded, but obedience is invariably punished. So Latin America has had a precipitous decline in its participation in the world economy. Now, I think finally we have to make a distinction between the world capital markets and the domestic rentiers, which was my last point. We have, for example, in Brazil, in my country, we have 10,000 families that are the creditors of the state. And their basic attitude is, pay us first. And that's a practical question. That it depends on their power and their influence in the society, amplified through the means of communication, promoting this doctrine of fiscal rectitude. And here there is a complication. Danny said it's austerity to include the fiscal element. But one could have the following idea. One could say, we are building up a shield of saving and subordinating the Keynesian countercyclical policies, not in order to satisfy financial confidence, but so that the state and the nation not depend on financial confidence. So in the very short run, the two attitudes can seem to take the same practical expression, but their motivation is the opposite. And the practical consequences of this difference of motivation can become clearer later on. And this is very significant in parts of the world, like my part, where the left, having abandoned faith in Marxism, then converted to vulgar Keynesianism and to the idea that they could simply spend their way out of economic slumps, failing to recognize these complications that I tried to call attention to. Now, our main topic, finance and the real economy. So the central issue, the central theoretical idea is a version of a proposition that has played a central role in the arguments of the course. A market economy has no single necessary and natural form. It can be organized in different ways. And one of the dimensions in which it can be organized in different ways is how it governs the relation of finance to the real economy or to the production system. So under the so-called orthodox ideas, a perfectly competitive capital market will automatically allocate resources to their most efficient use. If there is a problem If there is a failure, the failure must reside in some localized competitive flaw, or else in the failure of the equally localized regulatory response to the localized regulatory flaw. Every problem must come down to a version of one of these two flaws. What that idea denies is what I want to assert is in fact the case. Different institutional arrangements for the market order may either tighten or loosen the relation of finance to the real economy and to the production system. Finance can become bloated. It can devour a larger and larger part of profit in the economy and talent in the society, while contributing less rather than more to the production system. So we can imagine institutional arrangements that alter this relation between finance and the real economy, or finance and the productive agenda of society. That relation is not a constant. It is a variable, and it is susceptible to changes in the underlying institutional arrangements. Now, this is not just a proposition about the future, about hypothetical alternatives. It's also a proposition about the interpretation of historical experience. So, for example, I mentioned in an earlier class the conflict that took place in the United States in the first half of the 19th century about the financial system. There was a contest over the national bank. It culminated in the presidency of Andrew Jackson, in the dissolution of the Second National Bank of the United States. And for over 100 years in the United States, banks were forbidden from operating in more than one state of the Union. This was the device by which the Americans created the most decentralized system of credit at the disposal of the local producer as well as of the local consumer that had ever existed in the world until then. When they did this, they were not regulating the capital market. They were inventing a kind of capital market, a relation between finance and the production system that had not existed before. And that's the kind of thing, which I want to argue, has to be done once again. So against the background of those propositions, I want to then present three enigmas that, to my mind, have no adequate explanation within the orthodox view, but do have an explanation within this alternative view that I just began to outline. So the first enigma can be stated in the form of a simple question. What is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets of the world? All of that liquid capital that the world is awash in seems to have only an episodic or an oblique relation to the funding of production. An episodic relation, for example, in initial public offers in the stock market, or an oblique relation insofar as finance establishes a benchmark of value in the stock markets against which, theoretically, companies could borrow. The truth is that the vast majority of the funding of production is internally generated within the production system itself, well over 80 or 90%, on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. And that the vast majority of financial activity bears no relation to the funding of production. Now, is this necessarily the case? Or could we design a system that tightens the relation between finance and the real economy, that diminishes financial hypertrophy, this useless bloating of the financial system, and enhances financial deepening, the service that finance renders to the real economy. And our principle would then be that the best way to make finance less dangerous would be to make it more useful. Now that then brings me to the second enigma. The second enigma is that finance is relatively indifferent to the real economy in good times because the real economy finances itself to a large extent, but then becomes destructive in bad times. Financial crisis or volatility spills over and ends up damaging the real economy. So there is this asymmetry. The third enigma is that the most important social responsibility of finance, which would be the funding of the creation of new assets in new ways, in fact occupies a minuscule portion of the total amount of financial activity. That's what we call venture capital and its equivalents. Even in the economies in the world in which it is most established, United States and Israel, it is a minuscule thing compared to the totality of financial activity. All of these enigmas have an answer in the alternative view, in the view that says these paradoxes arise from the same cause. They arise from the inadequate relation of finance to the production system, to the real economy. Now, before I go any further and describe what I imagine as the general line of solution, let me relate this account of the general idea and the enigmas to the recent historical experience of the run-up to the financial and economic crisis of 2008. So how were we to understand, in essence, the background to this crisis? At the end of the New Deal, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Americans, the United States, began to conduct a style of economic growth based on mass consumption, popularization of purchasing power. But we know that in the closing decades of the 20th century, especially from the 1970s on, the United States began to undergo a violently regressive redistribution of income and wealth. How was it possible to reconcile a style of growth led by mass consumption with this radical increase of inequality? Part of the answer is it was reconciled on the basis of a radical expansion of credit and debt, of leverage, made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral. And thus the Americans put a kind of fake credit democracy in the place of a real property-owning democracy. That was the essential causal background of the crisis. And all of the speculative financial products that flourished in this atmosphere were made possible in that permissive climate. Now, of course, this expansion of domestic credit and leverage was in turn enabled by the structural imbalances in the world economy. The United States became a deficit economy with a trade deficit and a capital deficit. China was the surplus economy with a capital surplus and a trade surplus and a capital surplus. And the trade between them, the interaction between them, became the motor of growth in the world economy, the most important motor of growth. And each of these two countries used these structural imbalances as a way of escaping, of evading the imperative of internal structural change. The Chinese used it, export-led growth, as a way of evading the need to deepen their internal market, which would have required massive redistribution among classes, regions, and sectors, inherently conflictual and dangerous to the established political regime. And the Americans used it to escape the creation of an inclusive political economy, including an inclusive form of the knowledge economy, the new advanced form of production. Trying to maintain growth just on the basis of consumption and easy money implemented by the central bank. Now, so the stimulus that was then given in response to the crisis could have been used not just to bail out the finance houses, but to prefigure the elements of this alternative economic strategy. Of course, it wasn't. Now then we come to the second element, the re-regulation of finance. Finance was supposedly under-regulated. There was a dominant regulatory strategy in the second half of the 20th century, the strategy that I call the strategy of regulatory dualism. A thickly regulated sector of the highly regulated financial institutions that took federally insured deposits, and a thinly regulated sector inhabited by high net worth individuals and financial professionals. And what happened was that everything that was prohibited in the thickly regulated sector was relabeled and repackaged and smuggled into the thinly regulated sector. So all of these dangerous financial derivatives that we hear about were in fact exiles from the thickly regulated sector through this operation. Then came the effort to re-regulate finance, and look at what they did. They had an attempt to reestablish the old deal, the old New Deal regulatory framework, dividing proprietary trading from federally deposited insurance. There was a new technocratic agenda of increasing the power of the federal government to liquidate and turn around. There was the agenda of the international financial elite, headquartered in Basel, to increase the capital adequacy requirements of the banks. And there was the consumer protection agenda. What do those agendas have in common? They have in common that they did nothing to change the relation of finance to the real economy, or even to repudiate and replace the strategy of regulatory dualism. Absolutely nothing. So that's what resulted from that episode. A complete abdication of what was necessary. So what then in general is necessary? And I think we can distinguish the short term from the long term. In the short term, one would want, on the one hand, rules and policies that discourage or prohibit financial activities that make no plausible contribution to the enhancement of productivity and the expansion of output. For example, the option contracts, which in the commodity markets where they started, had the value, the utility of expanding liquidity. But in the equity markets to which they were transported had no such function. And thus, a device which had been designed as a safeguard against risk was converted into an instrument of gambling. On the positive side, you would say, multiply channels between the accumulated saving of society in the private and public pension systems and productive investment, for example, organize part of the pension money into diversified portfolios that would do the undone work of venture capital, the funding of the creation of new assets in new ways. Let's say that's all the short term. Now, what's the long term? The long term is to begin to move in the direction of the device that we discussed in a previous class. The productive assets of society are placed in independent trust or entities of some such nature, not under government allocation. There's a roving capital auction, and anyone gets to use them who can ensure those trusts of the highest rate of return. So there's a roving capital auction. And you can imagine any number of intermediate steps between here and there, because that's just an extreme thought experiment. But you can imagine a series of transitions in that direction. And what is all of this? It's simply the application to finance of the general idea that a market order has no single natural and necessary form. That we are not restricted to regulating it or to attenuating its inequalities through retrospective tax and transfer. We can reinvent it. We can change its legal and institutional architecture.
Let me suggest two areas of enhancement in the financial systems that would more closely link financial systems to the real economy. But before I do that, I will say that I'm less clear than you are as to how we would be able to, in general, distinguish forms of financial innovation and financial instruments that directly contribute to productivity or production from those that do not, as a matter of ex ante regulation. I think ex post is clear to see when things go bad, where there was excessive leverage may have played a role, but I gave this example before. Even in the case of the mortgage crisis and the expansion of lending for housing, for a lot of that period, there was actually a very good argument as to why this was a good thing in terms of democratizing mortgage lending and housing finance, that these new credit instruments, CDOs and CDSs and all the sort of new forms of intermediaries that were engaged in mortgage lending, that they were enabling a much larger group of borrowers to access finance for housing purposes. And that's productive. It provides a useful function for people. And I think with hindsight, it's a lot easier to say that that went too far. But in general, I don't think that we will be able to make those distinctions in an ex ante regulatory manner. Many options and derivatives are tied into, price discovery or insurance that might, have in principle useful function as well. So I have a bit of a concern that as a regulatory matter, whether we can draw a sharp line
So just on that point, Danny,
Yeah.
do you think that a partial response to that concern has to do with this issue of experimental administration? That is, instead of having these radical shifts in regulatory paradigms, you would go stepwise and you would actually observe how the changes are processed in the financial markets.
In principle, yes. I mean, in general, yes. But I think there's also the concern that, financial innovation always moves a lot faster than financial regulation. So that sort of imbalance is going to exist, and regardless of the speed at which or the scope of regulation. But so I guess it's more a kind of a general issue that would not necessarily be addressed by the scope or the experimental nature of it. But I'm going to come back at the end and suggest that maybe our concern with sort of the appropriate forms of financial regulation and explicit forms of tying in finance with the real economy, maybe that's not something that's so fundamental for the kinds of change that we're really talking about. But let me come to that at the end. Before I do that, I said there were two areas where I see significant enhancements that's possible, where we're doing too little, and where the financial system should do a lot more of. One is sort of long-term lending, particularly in the context of low and middle income countries, where long-term project finance is typically scarce. And there was an institution in the context of all these countries, including some advanced countries, called development banks. And they were public, and they were a main vehicle for channeling public or often sort of privately raised resources for long-term finance, for long-term investment projects. A very good example of this still exists in the form of the KfW in Germany. And still works very well. One of the best known examples, of course, is BNDES in Brazil, which has shifted its focus many times over the years. But these development banks, whose original goal was to provide financing for long-term projects with the patient capital, if you will, that private financial markets don't do necessarily a very good job of. That's generally a hole. And over time, this hole has become bigger as development banking has gone out of fashion. So part of the transformation of BNDES has been precisely sort of its movement away from a focus on long-term development finance to doing a lot of other stuff like financing privatization and things of that kind. But in a lot of other countries, development banks sometimes have been closed down, sometimes have become de-emphasized, but development banking has gone out of fashion, and I think there is only now sort of a kind of a resurgence. And it's important to think about long-term development banking, not only in the context of making patient capital or long-term loans available for large-scale investment, but also as a way of exploring and engaging in this process of productive discovery, of engaging where, for example, whether it's the green transition, climate-friendly investments, where it is investments in more worker-friendly or labor-friendly technologies, whether it's investments in small and medium-sized enterprises where a lot of good jobs might be created. So these are also instruments of broadening the productive capabilities of society, as long as the development bank sees what it is doing, not purely as a financial intermediary between private financial markets and borrowers, but also as an active actor of productive diversification, productive structural transformation. I think there is an important role for development banks, reinvigorated development banks to play that function. This, by the way, has often come in discussions of in the U.S. context as well, as thinking of creating some versions of this. The other is risk finance, or is what in the U.S. we'd call venture capital. So this is a very important shortage of risk capital or venture capital in the world. Even the Silicon Valley, as I think Roberto mentioned, it's a tiny portion of the total capital market in the United States, although it plays a disproportionate role in the creation of new innovations and new firms. So its share of investment capital might be less than 1%, but it has been critical basically in the establishment and creation of the most innovative companies of the last 30, 40 years. So that is a system that works in Silicon Valley. And there are very few examples of this in the world as a whole. I think in many other countries it would have to be created through the explicit push of the government. And I think an idea that Roberto has talked about, that's picked up in the readings, in the reading that you were assigned by Tammy Lothian, is the idea of sort of, public venture capital funds. So this is the idea that it would be publicly funded. The resources would come from the public resources, but these funds would be run by professionals that operate independently from day-to-day political control, and that they would be investing in a variety of projects just like venture capitalists do. It's very difficult to get venture capital to work right because so much of it really depends on the ecosystem and being able to undertake the project management and monitoring that the venture capitalists do. It's not just giving money, it's actually very close monitoring, setting the milestones, looking whether the companies are performing well, stepping in and changing the CEOs when that is needed. And that kind of very close monitoring is a critical aspect of successful venture capital.
So Danny, the venture capitalists themselves complain that the problem is not the scarcity of capital, but the scarcity of projects, that they don't have the good projects. And what that suggests is that in our earlier conception of extension, of lifting up the rear guard, there's one of the components is to help create the groups of people, of entrepreneurs and technicians, who would be potential candidates for something that looks like venture capital. So it's just a prior stage of extension.
Yes.
Is part of the lift-up operation.
Exactly, and this was actually going to be my final point. But before, as I come to that, sort of let me mention a kind of an example of a successful public venture fund in a middle-income country, which was the Chilean case of the Fundación Chile, which was set up and operated pretty much along the lines that I've just described. And one of the critical features of venture capital, of course, is that you need only a small number of your projects to succeed. Most of them will end up as failures, but the return on the successful ones will more than pay for all the failures. And this was exactly how the Fundación Chile worked out, where essentially 4 projects paid for everything else. And one of them was, in fact, the project of modernizing and expanding the salmon industry in Chile, and turned Chile into a major salmon exporter. And so that shows the potential of these kinds of transformative venture capital, public venture capitals. Now, there's an issue where the money was going to come. In the case of the Fundación Chile, it was set up because of some money that the US gave Chile as part of the compensation for some political ITT, and so there was some money which was directly used. So a lot of countries have sovereign wealth funds. Some of the resources could be used for this. Otherwise, I think that's one argument for actually a process of increasing your savings over a certain period of time, so that you can actually, if you don't have your natural resource base or large amount of public resources to start with, that raising this sort of your savings over a period of time so you can build up resources for something like this would be important. Let me just say, one final point that's going to be linked with the comment that you just made. I mentioned earlier that in the end, all the reforms and what we do and our concern about the financial sector and tying it with the real economy perhaps is not as important if the constraint is not finance per se, right? So if it is indeed true that in many of these settings, the shortage is not of capital per se or of finance, but of productive projects, then simply making more finance available and reforming finance and increasing the varieties in which finance could in principle contribute to the real economy is not going to make much of a difference if the demand for that finance isn't there, right? So there's two sides to every financial transaction. There is the investment demand side and there's the investment supply side. The investment supply side is the financial resources that go into financing that investment. That's what we want the financial sector and financial intermediation, all these financial institutions to be there for, to provide the finance when the investment demand exists. But where does the investment demand come from? These are the entrepreneurs, the potential investors, the businesses, large and small, who are actually want to invest in different projects. If there are not productive projects, or if the existing projects are not viewed as sufficiently productive, the demand for finance is not going to be there. The demand for investment finance that we actually care about is not going to be there. So this is where it connects with everything else in the rest of the course and all the focus there in terms of being able to increase the potential for these productive projects. And there, the shortages may not be finance. It might be the right kinds of skills. It might be the right kinds of ideas. It might be the right organizations. It might be the constraints on technology and its diffusion and dissemination. It might be the constraints on the type of technologies. It might be sort of lack of productive ecosystems, which industrial policies or other types of policies may start to fill in. So when the constraint is on the productivity side, on the availability of productive projects, or on the conceptions of the entrepreneurs and the business people themselves or the small and medium-sized firms to be able to foresee the presence of profitable investments. If that problem is not solved, investment, the financial side is not going to help. At most, you're going to have a kind of a hypertrophic, financial sector that simply sloshes money around for gambling purposes, but doesn't really end up serving the real economy. So I think, and my sense is that a lot of the times the constraints are not on the financing side, and that's in fact exactly why the Keynes view that ultimately growth produces the savings is true. The growth comes when you have the productive projects. When you have the productive projects, then that's when people start to save, retained earnings start to kick in. The finance follows, the rise in saving follows the growth opportunities. And that's, I think, the underlying microeconomics of why increase in savings tend to follow growth rather than necessarily lead it. Shall we? Yep.
So I'm curious, both in existing examples, but also conceptually on a perhaps theoretical, enlarged American scale, significant development bank. What are market mechanisms that can be used? I know in Asia, for example, export tracking was used to monitor the effectiveness of public investments. Maybe co-investment with a private party at a particular investment return rate. But I'd be curious what thinking there has been on ways of a developed country like the U.S., if we were to create a massive development bank of some sort, how it could make sure that money isn't being thrown away, how it could add some market rigor to its investment strategy.
Well, I mean, in principle, there's no, you can still use the same benchmark, which is, return on investment, right? And then, venture capital funds, they look at, 4x, 6x, 8x, right? And so in principle, you can use that, and it's the same. You can observe what the return is, there's a difficulty in that. Private venture makes its money at the IPO stage, right? That's when you sell it off. And then the question is what happens with public venture capital, if you don't have a well-developed, stock market, when do you realize the returns from those public investments? You cannot sell it. In the case of the Chilean salmon industry, the returns were realized when you sold the project to a Japanese investor, right? So that but then the idea is that if these projects end up being successful, even in the absence of a well-developed stock market, you can sell it to a private investor, and that's when the returns get realized. But I think as a public venture capital, you also have to be careful that the return is not just a private return. Hopefully you're investing in projects that have social returns that exceed the private return. So for example, if you had the equivalent of what I'm suggesting for making, green investments in green technology, right? You would have to price in the climate benefits of the new technologies that you're investing. So it would be, the return would not be just the private return, the price at which you're able to effectively sell off this investment to a private entity, but also you would have to price in the externalities from this, and that becomes more judgmental. But the tools for doing that are in place. The idea is that ultimately you can recoup that through the general taxation. So even investments on which you might make losses on the basis of a financial rate of return might be socially profitable and might be worth engaging in. Simbi?
So going through the readings and trying to understand essentially around the issue around contagion, right? So financial systems are fragile, and to a certain extent, most of what we discussed has been national solutions that are nation-specific and on the back. But we've also seen that these crises have had a very global, a very international dimension to it. So I'm curious in terms of where the space for multilateralism exists for cooperation, or even for even certain countries defending themselves against, basically the excess of their neighbors, so to speak. So that's kind of just wanted to get a sense of that.
Yeah, I think most of the responsibility for dealing with issues of contagion have fallen in practice on national governments, and we see that most directly in the reactions to the Asian financial crisis. That what happened as a consequence was that countries started to increase their reserves like crazy. The general rule before financial globalization was that every country should hold maybe 3 or 4 months of reserves just to finance imports. The point of reserves was to really have enough liquidity to finance your regular foreign commercial activities. After the Asian financial crisis, countries went on this sort of building up reserves, so this war chest, so that to protect yourself from the next contagion, from the next sudden stop of private capital for whatever reason, maybe because your neighbor was having a hard time. And so countries began to build this incredibly large war chest in terms of foreign reserves of 12 months of imports. And reserves are very expensive because essentially you're using your domestic resources that could have gone to finance investments to invest it in very short-term, low-paying U.S. Treasury securities. So it's a very sort of money-losing proposition for the nation as a whole. So the alternative would have been, for example, for the global multilateral financial regime to facilitate more extensive cross-border regulation of capital flows, so that because you can insulate yourself from global financial volatility by building this war chest to have that reserves to sell when you need to, but you can also do that by moderating flows of capital. So when you're in this euphoric stage of the process, slow it down. But also when the bad time comes in and there is excessive outflow of capital, also to step in and prevent all that capital from leaving. So that sort of capital flow measures or capital controls, a lot of countries have been unwilling to engage in because of the bad signal they send to financial markets. You don't want to be, seen as a kind of a country that tends to, prevent capital flows. So I think, globally, there could have been a bigger role for the IMF in particular in legitimizing the use of capital flows, capital flow controls or capital flow measures, as well as disseminating knowledge about how to do that more effectively. The IMF went a little bit in that direction by essentially moving its official line from capital controls are bad to capital controls can be good as a last measure. So there was some change in the official line globally with regard to capital flows, but I think it came too late, and I think it has not been particularly effective. And so one puzzle to me is why countries actually don't use capital controls more so. I think you talk to central bankers or finance ministers, they say, well, it's very hard to use because finance always finds a way, and it's very hard to do this surgically. And
but the central problem is the direction, right? I mean, it's not just what safeguards are being negotiated internationally. So, for example, the BRIC countries established a bank, a development bank. What does this development bank finance? It finances infrastructure because the Chinese want to have ports so that Brazil can send its untransformed iron ore and soy to them and so forth. But they could have a completely different idea. They could think, we'll make the priority the development of semiconductors and ultraviolet lithography and so forth. We'll establish an ascendancy in advanced production among the BRIC countries. That should be their priority. And that would be that would be revolutionary and have vast consequences over the long term in the world economy.
Yeah. So again, so I was focusing on the part of the question that had to do with making global finance safer. Again, the question is, that's a limited objective. Can we actually make global finance, a positive thing for productive?
Going back to the idea, you make it safer by making it more useful.
I'm not sure that I think there are issues with, financial fragility and instability. The more finance you try to make available for the more projects. So I think that's potentially the trade-off. Yeah, over there.
Thank you. I just had a question which may be an aside, but it touches upon the war chest, BRICS, and currency reserve point, and thinking about the current situation of Russia, Ukraine. We've been hearing over the last week or two, ruble, rupee exchanges on the oil side, and Saudi Arabia announced last week, they've been talking about this for some time, about the sort of Petro One. I was wondering, from your perspective, what are the constraints for a dollar-pegged, sovereign wealth holding, large currency holding, OPEC exporter de-dollarizing? What does that look like, and what are the constraints?
Who are you asking?
Either or.
And why the dollar?
Sorry?
Why the dollar?
They've announced that they're going to be sort of selling in one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, the issue has to do with the liquidity and the depth of the markets and the variety of investment vehicles. I think that's effectively the constraint. But, I don't think it's, for historical reasons, of course, the dollar, and I think, euro has been expanding, but it's very hard to. There is an issue with whether, and the Chinese have gone back and forth on this, on whether you want to make your currency, fully convertible and an investment vehicle. And I think that might impart a certain degree of financial instability, which the Chinese have been quite rightly cautious about. But I think, we've seen, I think the Russian case, I think does speak to your point, which is that I think, Russia has, but in a somewhat different way perhaps, I think Russia has retained significant autonomy on its ability to carry out its ends because it runs a very large trade surplus. So as long as the Europeans do not cut off their imports of oil and natural gas, then there is a kind of an ongoing inflow of dollars or foreign currency into the economy that prevents the Russian economy from totally collapsing. Now, the reserves in which they had built a huge amount of, it turns out, under this exceptional set of circumstances, are not as useful as they might have thought, because in the end you're still holding dollars and euros, and they're not available for any use. If the rest of the the Europeans and the Americans don't want them to be of any use to you. Take some, Michelle.
Yes, and when we try to make use of the financial markets or the real economy markets, in the example of Israel, when they took very aggressive steps to divide between the real economy and the financial economy, and they made holding companies to divest either their financial firms or their real economy firms. And I wanted to hear your thought about whether this is necessary or is it good step to take, or maybe to have financial firms holding real economy firms and vice versa.
Well, the distinction has been undermined, hasn't it, all over the world? Because, so take the United States. The firms with the highest capitalization in the United States hold vast pools of liquid capital. And they go to the financial markets, and they do financial operations, even though they're non-financial firms. So the categorical distinctions have already been subverted, and there's nothing that can be done about that.
I guess one of the advantages of the financial system is shown.
I'm not hearing.
Can you speak up, please?
Yeah, I guess one of the advantages of the financial system can be seen, for example, like the COVID pandemic. Like when when most of the other major economic sectors, like the service and the manufacturer, were strapped, the financial sectors were less strapped compared with those. I think one of the reasons is that they have enough inventories to keep profiting themselves. So my question is, why do you think such innate advantage actually does not transform into a safety buffer to prevent the economic crash, especially we've seen in many low and medium income countries? And how do you think the government can actually leverage such kind of advantages through the policy tools?
Well, I mean, if the financial system has been resilient during the COVID crisis, is because of the huge backstop that the central banks and here the Fed has provided, and I think it's it's just a public, so the financial sector otherwise is the most vulnerable because of the financial sector's fragility arises from the fact that its assets are typically long-term and not very liquid, and the liabilities are short-term and liquid. So a panic and bank run is the fundamental source of the financial sector's fragility, because the moment there is any concern, any worry that a financial institution may be insolvent, might not have enough resources, then everybody wants their money back or wants to stop lending short term, but the assets of these financial institutions are tied up in longer term investments, and they cannot be liquidated that quickly. and that makes them short of liquidity, and then that can then sort of turn into a kind of a contagion, because then they have to withdraw their resources from other financial institutions, which then makes them sort of others fall into that kind of situation. The only thing that stops that, and that stopped it during the pandemic, is the ability of the Fed to provide trillions of resources available just as a kind of as a lender of last resort. If that is done for small and medium-sized enterprises through the, for example, Paycheck Protection Program or employment protection programs in Europe, if you can backstop employment, you can do that for the real economy as well. And that, in some ways, was the difference that Roberto alluded to with the financial crisis. That during the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. There was a backstop and bailing out of the financial system and some large enterprises and insurers, but not the bailing out of, let's say, the actually the homeowners or or generally the small and medium-sized enterprises and so forth. So I think we've learned something from that. I think that in many ways the response to the pandemic was much more balanced and much better. So I don't think there's anything special in a good direction in terms of the financial system. If anything, they are the source of much greater instability and fragility, which is why you have to make these incredible amount of resources as a backstop. Alex?
I had a question around one of the fundamental failures of the existing system seems to be around a fundamental asymmetric information problem around the banks just, for example, with being effective at not condoning bad behavior by governments. It feels like it's not the incentives of the bank, but rather just an asymmetric information of not understanding what governments are doing. To what extent, kind of within the existing system, would better data, better information, some of the technologies that we discussed at the very beginning of this course, would they be able to remedy some of these market failures and make finance effective?
Who is the they? The banks?
How were the they in terms of putting in place better data? That can be governments, etc., but making banks more effective, yes.
I guess I don't understand clearly the background assumptions.
I think the argument was that banks are not doing a very good job of evaluating credit risk.
By governments?
By governments, right? So that and partly because that was one of the conclusions that was drawn after the Asian financial crisis. Also,
But you mean by their own governments or by other governments?
by the governments that they're borrowing to, so that Indonesia had, or the South Korea had all this short-term debt that wasn't very, very clear to them, or that the Greeks were playing around with their fiscal numbers, and that. So
That's a special case, because the main thing in finance is the relation between the banks and their own governments, the governments of their own countries. And the greatest mystification in this whole business is one to which Danny indirectly alluded. The banks are in the hands of the government. So the banks pretend to do these hold-up operations. They go as the committee of the rentiers and talk to the government. Do this, have the surplus, and so forth. It's a joke, because the banks are in the hands of the government. And then the banks pretend that the government are in their hands. That's the basic confusion in this dialogue. The banks are essentially an instrument of the government. The government can do anything it likes with the banks. It can break them overnight. But if they have some independent influence in the society, because, for example, in Brazil, 10,000 families are the creditors of the state. They're the moneyed class. They own the newspapers, they own the media, they form public opinion in the country, and they're engaged in this perpetual hold-up operation.
So
Yes.
when we had sort of the mercantilist understanding of the economy,
Yes.
then it was at least clear that it was basically the state was chartering all these companies for its own ends.
Yes.
So then at least it was maybe just enriching the coffers of the sovereign, no broader public purpose than that. But at least it was clear
The secret
that the
was out of the
banks
bag,
and,
yes.
and the corporations were serving the end of the state.
Yeah.
So from mercantilism we went to this sort of market system, and where the idea was, in fact, Adam Smith was basically revolting precisely against the use of the system for bad public purposes. And then the idea was that if we can sever these links, right, if we can sever these links, then the market can do its job for a broad public purpose that would be to serve everybody. And the remit of the government would be sort of limited. And so, but then this unanticipated consequence that it turns out that you cannot have financial systems without them being deeply reliant on the state, but that gets now completely obscured by an understanding of how capitalism really operates. That's very different from the reality.
Yes. Back there.
Yes, building on this topic of the use of new technologies and the relationship between the state and the financial system, I'm curious to see, to hear a little bit of your opinions on the risks and opportunities of decentralized finance and the use of blockchain.
Yeah, I don't understand what function blockchain really performs except for just anonymity. And that can be good for a lot of things. It can be also be bad in terms of hiding wealth and things of that kind. And then on top, it's susceptible to all the problems of fragility, instability, overshooting that unregulated financial markets are subject to, with none of the potential benefits of being able to mobilize it for public purpose in the ways that, for the real economy in the ways that we've been talking about. So I'm happy to be convinced otherwise. But that would be my short take on this.
Yeah, thank you. On the issue of, I just think referring to the Admati and the Johnson reading, you've mentioned that some of the financial stability reforms, the bank balance sheet reform that have been taken under the post-crisis, following the crisis, have been insufficient. I just wanted to know, what are your thoughts about what we could do? We've been exposed to, I think, the one idea was around equity holding, increasing equity holding in banks. What do you think is practical to do within that space of financial stability and strengthening bank balance sheets? You touched briefly the discussion around some of the Basel III changes. What direction do you think we can move? And I don't know if you have any thoughts clearly that you want.
You asking me?
The both of you.
Well, I would just say that I think, Anat Admati's view that capital requirements should be much higher. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think the change there is we're not talking about a marginal increase. It would be a very large increase. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I think the economic argument for much higher capital requirements is a very good one. Again, and I think along the lines of the Simon Johnson argument, I think probably one of the most important things that we can do there is campaign finance reform of just reducing the influence of money in politics. So those are sort of concrete things that are already sort of on the agenda and I think would be very good. But again, these are do no harm things and we want us also to think about this, about the role of finance more broadly. Yep.
I just ask you, when I think about the US and China right now, it's probably financial financial regulation where I see the biggest divergence in policy making. And crypto and venture capital, let's say two new movements where the US is basically tolerated and allows a lot of innovation there. China has banned cryptocurrency. In the VC world, it has come and sort of nationalized a lot of the ed tech companies. So I just would love to get your views on, in the next phase of, I guess, the world and financial innovation, which policy or which angle do you think will succeed, or which one do you think leads to a better link to the real economy, as you suggest?
Succeed with respect to finance? Is that what you're asking?
Succeed in respect to linking finance to the real economy.
Uh-huh.
Because it seems to me, at least when I take it literally, that China's policies are trying to do that. And America's are probably much more trying to encourage innovation and see where innovation takes us.
Well, it's interesting. So think for example, of this question of the pension systems, right? So there's all that money there. It's largely dormant. Its productive use is sterilized. Could we place it in trusts and independent funds that have professional management, that are subject to market discipline and some competitive restraint on their returns, but that mimic venture capital over a much broader scale? So playing this role of funding the creation of new assets in new ways, lifting up the people who are not yet natural candidates for a venture capital. I think there's a huge area there for experimentation. And it seems to me that the most important area in which to connect finance with the real economy is our subject of the creation of a knowledge economy for the many.
But I mean, I think you're broadly right that China, of course, traditionally has had a much more proactive policy of using the financial system, the credit system, for guiding investment and stimulating investment. And I think so. The use of credit subsidies through the banking system has been both predominant and also very significant in the emergence of some industries like solar cells or the PV cells or the wind industries. So with some of them with very important global externalities because of these are renewable sources of energy. That's partly in large part due to heavy investment in China, spurred by financial subsidies through the banking system. Then there's always, as there's the downside of these things. These credit subsidies can also end up increasing non-performing loans on balance sheets, and there's a lot of financial fragility, a lot of financial skeletons hidden in the state banking sector in China as well. And every 10 years you have this thing that big financial crisis in China, and then so far they've avoided it. So that's those are the two stories with China.
But I think that one of the most important lessons is that capital all by itself means very little, right? So the crucial thing is the link of access to credit with access to advanced practice and knowledge and technology. It's that orchestration that's the crucial element. And so that's the nature of the practical problem. Now, the question is, if that's done by some form of discretionary allocation from a central government office, then we have reason to expect that things will go wrong. So we have to find a way to create a system which is in some sense public and not under the control of the moneyed classes, but that is pluralistic, experimental, subject to market competition. That's the general nature of the problem. So on the one hand, orchestrating the different things that are normally separate, A successful venture capitalist always does that, but he does that only in his own in his own little world. So, but that's the content of the practical problem. But then we have to relate that to the problem of institutional design. How do we create an alternative to discretionary governmental allocation on the one hand and control by the present owners of capital on the other? And if we could solve both of those problems simultaneously, we would have the beginnings of a different system.
Good. I'll see you all next Monday.
Mexico track. My friend said I was running it.
Oh, so yeah, no, you know so as well.
Oh, cool.
It was very fun.
No, doesn't sound like Sebas at all.
No, honestly, the thing was, Sebas was pushed me to organize man.
Yeah.
Even though really he wanted to. He signed up as a track member and paid for his track. Like, the other Mexicans that were supposed to be there all dropped out.
Yeah.
So in the end, it was only him. And like then, like the Mexican Alumni Association was really for that.
Yeah.
He was like late. Yeah, it was a bit of a mess.
Why was it such a mess? What was the?
I think it's a mix.
Highlight was lowlights.
Well, I think the absolute highlight of his was a disastrous trip back to France, where low light, well, highlight was stress.
Okay.
Where the airlines